Ukraine explodes in violence. Kiev, Ukrayina. A circumflex. The standoff between Ukrainians UN agency need European-style democracy associate degree. The government that's aligned with Russia on Tues erupted an associate degree explosion of violence that might light an east-west confrontation thought long buried. Thousands of police armed with stun grenades and water cannons rush at protesters in an exceedingly camp in Ukraine's capital. Once weeks of calm during which the two sides gave the impression to err the verge of a compromise. But the Ukraine parliament's refusal to vote on a bill to revive a 2004 constitution limiting the powers of President Viktor Yanukovych angered anti-government protesters, who've been occupying the streets for weeks. Marching toward Parliament, they were halted by police and riot gear. UN agency even have been within the streets for 4 weeks standing guard. Nobody is aware of UN agency discharged initial. However, once the fighting was over, 20 Ukrainians lay dead and thousands alive were injured, same Oleh Musiy, organizer of medical services. The risk here is tremendous as a result of Ukrayina's associate degree industrial powerhouse in an exceedingly strategic location, says Ariel Cohen, a Russia analyst at the Heritage Foundation. UN agency says this country of 50 million is on the verge of warfare. Ukraine's industrial may circumflex manufacturing everything from food to craft. A circumflex mean its markets are going to be a serious influence on Europe's economic future. However, its role as a strategic buffer between Europe and Russia, at a time when President Vladimir Putin seeks to regain dominance over republics Russia once controlled, suggests that it might be a robust ally to the or associate degree antagonist. This is crazy. It's sort of a real war. A circumflex. They're getting to kill one another. Same protester Lyudmila Mazur, 50, as she watched protesters attack a police barricade that blocked the thanks to Parliament. I do not know if there's differently currently because the government understands solely force, she supplemental. When we tend to work complaining peacefully, they did not hear us. The leaders of the protesters say the battle royal ends all need for a compromise with the government. They vulnerable to bring many thousands into the streets, and square measure pleading with the US and Europe to confront national capital over what they assert may be a usurpation of their fledgling democracy. Musical group by statesmen. Opposition leader Vitaly Klitschko saying that Yanukovych an agreement to satisfy with opposition leaders early weekday, however it's going to be too late. All the planet is observance. Ukraine, same Klitschko. I cannot imagine operating with Yanukovych's government currently. He referred to as on Yanukovych to comply with the reforms associate degree decision an early election, or face a heavy step-up of the crisis. We square measure talking minutes, not hours, Klitschko told reporters. Ukraine has been troubled to take care of its independence and unity since its throne broke away in 1991 from the Russia, the previous communist world power that dissolved in associate degree rebellion of its own. It was one in all many republics subsumed by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics throughout its nearly 7-decade existence, during which is put in puppet regimes and captive nations that enclosed a lot of Japanese Europe. But Ukraine is far and away the biggest, the second largest country land-wise in Europe besides Russia. In the breakup, Ukraine in agreement to offer up the nuclear arsenal the Soviets primarily based there throughout the conflict, in which US-backed Western Europe ironed for freedom behind the ideological barrier, wherever nations like Polska, Bulgaria, Baltic state and European nation were smothered by repression and stagnation. At the time, Ukraine looked to International Organization for Defense, however was denied admission out of concern for provocative Russia, then undergoing makes an attempt to democratize. The fault lines before long became apparent in Ukraine. Russian is spoken within the Japanese and southern regions of the country, wherever economic and cultural ties with national capital square measure robust. However, Western Ukraine, wherever the independence movement was born, wished nearer ties to the 28-nation EU. The ascension to power of statesman, a former officer within the Soviet UN agency referred to as the ending of the despotic Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the greatest government catastrophe of the century, solely pushed Western Ukraine to press even tougher to flee from Moscow's orbit. Putin expressly urged his country to regain influence over what was lost, and he acted on that in 2008 in Georgia once he sent in Russian troops to place down what he said was a trial by the electoral government to interact communicative voters there. The troops stay, and also the message was received. Then came what anti-Russian Ukrainians felt was getting to be a serious shift toward Europe and aloof from Russia, a comprehensive trade written agreement that may have guided Ukraine's economic future toward free markets with the EU Union. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians protested peacefully for the written agreement, and in Gregorian calendar month the government violently distributed them from the middle of the capital. They came with many thousands to press for a deal that Yanukovych had once vowed to sign. But instead, he suddenly referred to as off the language ceremony and appeared in national capital, wherever he declared he was instead getting to be part of a labor union with Russia reciprocally for $15 billion in loans and cut price gas. Protesters took over buildings in many cities, together with Capitol Hall. Once initial clashes and arrests, the two sides huddled, at the urging of the EU and USA. Senator John McCain, RI's UN agency, stood with protesters in Capitol, urged the Obama administration to press national capital to remain out. Moscow suspended its payments, the government free of numerous imprisoned activists. Over the weekend, protesters vacated buildings reciprocally for a vote on measures that may strengthen democratic establishments. But statesmen had issued warnings that he might ought to intervene in events a lot of powerfully in Ukraine, and on weekday, whereas opposition leaders were meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, he offered billions of latest greenbacks to stay Ukraine's sickly economy going. Word got out that Yanukovych was expected to nominate a replacement prime minister that the opposition was certain would be a Russian-leaning admirer. On Tuesday, the parliament refused to require a vote on the pro-democracy measures, at Yanukovych's urging. Same opposition leaders within the body, and also the protesters camped within the streets, marched straight at the phalanx of armed police. Moving into Independence Square, that has been the middle of nearly 3 months of protests, police destroyed a number of the barricades and plenty of the protesters' tents were assailed. Flames rages within the night, however the protesters refused to run. About 20,000 demonstrators fought with rocks, nuts and hearth bombs, singing the Ukrainian anthem all the whereas. The inside ministry according that 7 law enforcement officials were among the dead. EU policy chief Catherine choreographer saying she was deeply worried by the violence and urged politicians to address the basis causes. Russia blessed the upsurge on connivance by Western politicians and European structures, and their refusal to think about the aggressive actions of radical factions inside the protest movement. U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey R. Payette entailed dialogue, however additionally vulnerable each side with sanctions. We believe Ukraine's crisis will still be resolved via dialogue, however those on each side UN agency fuel violence can open themselves to sanctions, Payette said on Twitter. U.S. policy for the past 25 years has been to support the sovereignty of former Soviet republics. A 1994 agreement between Ukraine and also the USA guarantees Ukraine's security, however solely from outside attack. We got to clarify to Russia that any reasonably meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs is completely unacceptable, same Cohen of the Heritage Foundation. Ukraine may be a sovereign country, despite what some in Russia might imagine. Cohen says the Obama administration is trying to Russia facilitate pipe to assist back together violence in Syria and presumably help curtail Iran's nuclear program, thus it's going to think about Ukraine a distraction. The White House more experienced the violence with an announcement from VP Biden, UN agency referred to as on President Yanukovych to tug back government forces and have interaction in an exceedingly dialogue along with his individuals. There was no mention of Russia. Into the night, the pop of grenades might be detected here, and clouds of tear gas and smoke from burning cars and trucks stuffed the streets. Ukrainian authorities issued associate degree demand threatening severe measures, or the government will be duty-bound to revive order by any legal suggests that emergency services all square measure stuffed to the brink circumflex their obscurity to place individuals up. Irina Herashchenko, a member of parliament with the opposition Ukrainian Democratic Alliance for a Reform Party, told Capital Post. Justice Minister Oleh Musiy and in-depth Yanukovych aide suspect the opposition of violating earlier agreements with the government and blessed protest leaders for the violence. But once the surprising battle between Ukrainians, the government, sought after calm. Negotiations will solely happen once the opposition takes armed individuals off the streets and once calm is repaired, presidential authority Hannah Jasman told a RFE/RL broadcaster. What the opposition is doing currently, line of work more for armed conflict, may be a nice crime against the Ukrainian individuals and also the Ukrainian state. Opposition leader Arseniy Yatsenyuk saying there will be no calm as a result of the stakes for the country. This is the most dramatic amount within the history of Ukraine since independence, opposition leader Arseniy Yatsenyuk saying. The Ukrainian individual's square measure fighting for his or her freedom and liberty and that we can fight till finish. Klitschko saying it's within the interest of the Union and also the European states that Ukraine is political and economically stable, because instability in Ukraine may lead to instability within the entire region. Yatsenyuk represented Yanukovych as a person making an attempt to shop for time with never-ending negotiations. It may be a turning purpose within the history of Euromaidan, same Taras Berezovets, political analyst and head of Verge communications in Capital, relating the name adopted by the protest movement. For sure, these events, today, were planned and initiated by the government, inspired by Kremlin. If the protest is distributed, a whole lot or maybe thousands of activists are going to be in remission, together with opposition lawmakers. But in terms of resources Yanukovych has lost, he added. The question is, however long can his agony last and the way many of us he can bring down with him. Contributing, Luigi Serenelli in Kiev, Jabin Body in Berlin or Andorral in Washington.